Hi everyone, my name is Anagha and I'm part of the Data Science Discovery team, and in this video today we're going to be doing a question on simulation of drawing a card from a deck of cards in Python. So let's go ahead and get started. So here it says write a simulation in Python to simulate drawing 5,000 cards from a standard deck of playing cards. Right, for each card drawn in your simulation, store the card drawn as a number from 1 through 52. And then store and return your results in a data frame with a column card. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we basically want to simulate drawing 5,000 cards, right? And each card we draw should be represented by a number from 1 through 52. So that kind of tells us two things. One is that there's basically going to be a for loop involved, right? Because we want to have one iteration of the loop represent drawing one card, but we want to draw 5,000 cards. So we know that our for loop, which will keep drawing cards, should draw 5,000 cards, right? So it should essentially iterate or go through or repeat 5,000 times. So that's like the one thing to know. And our second thing is that we want to store the card drawn as a number. So that means we want to use some sort of random function, right? And we can see the random library is already imported, so that's good. We want to use some sort of random function to basically draw or store a random integer from 1 through 52. So, the kind of function that comes to mind is random.randint a comma b, where a represents our lower bound, and then b is our upper bound, and both are inclusive, right? So these are kind of the two things to keep in mind as we code our function. So the first thing to do is I'm going to go ahead and create my data list, right? So why do we need to create a list? Well, I know that I need to store and return my results in a data frame with the column card. So in order to create this data frame, I should have a list that stores all of these results of these 5,000 cards that I drew, right? So I need some sort of data structure to store all these results, and I'm gonna choose a list to store these results because it's just gonna be easier to compile into data frame at the end after all those 5,000 iterations are done, or after all those 5,000 cards are drawn. So the first thing is to create my data list, and my second step would be to create basically a loop that draws 5,000 cards. So it basically goes through 5,000 iterations, and each iteration represents drawing a card from a deck of cards at random. So basically my for loop is gonna go through and draw 5,000 cards at random, probably using this random.randint function. And I'm gonna have to find some way to store what card I drew in each iteration, so that at the end I could really compile it into the data frame. And then lastly, my third step would be to create my data frame that contains all of the cards drawn, right? And there's some sort of the data list that I create in the beginning should be storing all of my results, which will then be used to compile my final data frame. So this is kind of the rough structure of how we're going to code this. So the first thing is create the data list, right? So I can call my list anything I want, but I'm just going to call it data, and equals the open and closing brackets. That's how we create a list, an empty list in Python, right? If we print out data, we'll see that it basically has nothing in it because I haven't really stored anything, right? And these empty brackets, that signifies that, I haven't really stored anything because that's what I want, right? I want an empty list, which then I'll store all my results into. So now my step is going to be to create my loop. So I'm going to start a for loop in Python. So it's for I in range and then 5,000 because I want to draw 5,000 cards. And you may be thinking, well, I thought the loop started at 0. Well, the loop is going to go from 0 to 4,999. So that's going to be 5,000 iterations that we have. So that's how that logic works. And I is basically my, you can say like my iterator. It represents which iteration I'm on. So that's how we're going to keep track of how many cards we've drawn. So the first thing to do is go ahead and draw the card, right? Each iteration represents a card that I draw. So my first step is to basically draw the card. So let me call it card result, and I can use my random.randint function from 1 to 52, which basically is going to signify drawing a card at random, right? So card result basically stores the card that I drew. And if I want to go ahead and see what is happening here, I can print out card result and or I guess it's not going to execute. I can explicitly print out card result, and you know, if I was doing this in another IDE, it would basically print the result of my random.randint, just like a number from 1 to 52 5,000 times. So that's what would basically happen. So here, the next step to do is going to be to store my result somewhere, right? I'm going to have to store my result so I can create my data frame in the end. And the way to do that would actually be using a dictionary, right? So I want to, the syntax for doing that is going to be to first write your dictionary name. It can be anything you want. I'll just call mine D equals, and then in curly braces, you want to put the first value, which represents the kind of like the label basically for your entry that you're going to be making. So I'll just call it card, and you'll kind of see why later I'm calling it card. And then a colon, and the second value is going to be the actual value that you want to be stored in your entry. So here I want to store my card result, so I'm just going to go ahead and put card result as my value after the colon. So basically the syntax for creating a dictionary is going to be within your opening and closing braces. You want to put your label, and after the colon you want to put the actual value. So that's why I'm putting card and then the actual value of a card result. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and in each iteration, right, I want to go ahead and append my dictionary to my data list, right? Because my data list will be used to create my final data frame. So when I create this dictionary, it's basically just a bunch of entries, right, that I want to compile into this huge data list, which will then be used to create my data frame. So I want to create my entry, but I also want to store that somewhere, right? I can't just keep creating new entries in every iteration but not store that anywhere. That doesn't make sense, right? That's just going to be like, okay, I'm just drawing cards, but I don't store what cards I drew. That's kind of representative of this incomplete code we have here. So we want to go ahead and append our entry, our dictionary entry that we made, to our data list. So we're going to do that by doing data.append-d, which basically stores all of these entries, stores all of the cards that I drew into a final list that I call data, right? And if I print out what data looks like, it's basically going to be a huge list, right? As we can see with the brackets here, of all of these cards are entries that we drew and the entries that we made. And you can see the label for each of these entries is card, which was purposeful, right? Because our data frame results should be stored in a column called card. So I made a list that has dictionary entries where each label is card, because then when I compile it into a data frame, I can have a nice column where the name is card and all of the results of which cards I drew are basically stored within that. So we can see here that, data is essentially a list that stores all of these 6,000 or 5,000 entries. But that's not the result we want, right? We want a data frame. We don't want a list. So to make this list into a data frame, what we're going to do is we're going to use the pd.dataframe method. So I want to go ahead and at the outside of my loop, at the very end, right, this is an important part, seeing which lines of code are indented, which lines of code are contained within the iterations, and which lines of code are contained outside of the iterations. Because at the very end, I want to create my data frame, right? I have this huge list that contains, all of my results. And at the end, I want to create a data frame called df, or it can be called anything. I'll just call it df with the column card. So I want to do pd.dataframe data. And what this basically does is when I create a new data frame using pd.dataframe, I can have the syntax for that, like basically how the function works is that I can have as many dictionary entries as I want. And the first value of each entry should be the column, and the second value should be the actual result that I want to store in that column. And now it makes more sense why all of these entries have the same label is because they are all stored in the same column called card, right? So when I create a new data frame, all of these entries are going to be stored in the same column called card, and the second value just represents the results. So now that when I print out df, you can see much more clearly here, right? Basically, our entire data list was contained into a data frame column, right, where the column name is card and everything else contains the actual entries. So that it makes more sense why that is outside of the list, outside of the for loop. If this was inside of the for loop, each time I would be creating a whole new data frame and not storing that anywhere. I would basically be creating a data frame that only contains one entry. And you can even test it out and see it here, right? What if I stored this line of code inside of my for loop? Well, okay, I'm drawing my card, I'm storing that card in my dictionary, I'm adding that dictionary to my huge data list. Right now, my data list contains all of these numbers, and now when I create a data frame, creating a data frame for each result, basically. And even this exception shows here that there's too many data frames created. You should only create a single data frame. Make sure you're not accidentally creating too many data frames inside a loop, right? So this shows that you're basically creating 5,000 different data frames each time you iterate through the loop. So that's why we want that to be outside, right? We only want one data frame that should be created in our final code. Now when I go ahead and add that outside, let me just go ahead and refresh this really quick and try to see. So now when I go ahead and add it outside of my data frame, we can see here that we have created a data frame with the column called card, which stores all the results basically of our simulation, which is, I guess in this case, was 8,000 cards, right? And what we did in our code here was basically create a for loop that iterates each time. It draws a card at random, it stores that card in a dictionary, it appends that card, that entry, that card I just drew into a bigger data list, and finally that data list is compiled into a data frame. So now when I go ahead and run this code and submit it, we can see that I got it right. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll see you next time. Bye.